Imagine waking up to the news that nearly 300,000 federal workers, engineers, scientists, park rangers, firefighters, data analysts are simply gone. Overnight, entire offices shuttered, decades of institutional knowledge erased, paychecks worth $37 billion a year pulled out of local economies. That's not a government shutdown, that's a government amputation, and this isn't some slow drip of retirements. It's an explicit plan from the Trump White House, what critics are calling a war on the U.S. government, to slash the federal civilian workforce by 12.5% in just 1 year. The goal? Leaner bureaucracy, they say. The reality? Potential chaos in everything from wildfire response to Social Security claims. So tonight, we're unpacking the biggest federal downsizing since the 1990s. Who actually benefits? Who loses their livelihoods? And is this truly about efficiency or about consolidating political control over the machinery of government? This all started with a quiet but seismic announcement from the Office of Personnel Management in mid-August 2025. The agency projected that by year's end, roughly 300,000 positions would be eliminated, about 80% through voluntary departures like early retirements or buyouts, and the remaining 20% through forced removals. On paper, this isn't unprecedented. The federal government has slimmed down before, most notably in the 1990s, when buyouts and attrition cut over 426,000 jobs over 8 years. But this time, the timeline is radically shorter. We're talking 12 months to execute what took nearly a decade before. And the legal tools being used aren't just about balancing the books. The White House recently unveiled a new personnel category, Schedule Policy Chalk Career, modeled on Trump's controversial Schedule F from his first term. This reclassification could shift as many as 50,000 policy-adjacent roles, from agency attorneys to regulatory analysts, out of the traditional civil service protections. In plain English, that means easier, faster removal without the lengthy appeals process that normally safeguards career employees. Then there's the blunt instrument, the reduction in force, or RIF. Under 5 CFR Part 351, RIF allows agencies to lay off staff based on a combination of tenure, performance, and bump and retreat rights. It's a process with formal notice periods and, crucially, the right to appeal to the Merit Systems Protection Board. OPM has already updated its RIF guidance and instructed agencies to prepare milestone plans for these cuts. Critics argue that compressing this process into a single fiscal year invites legal chaos, mass appeals, injunctions, and an overburdened MSPB docket. Supporters counter that it's the only way to break what they see as a bloated, unaccountable bureaucracy. And the stakes aren't abstract. The U.S. Forest Service, for example, is already operating with 26% fewer staff than last year, including more than 1,400 certified wildfire responders in the middle of peak fire season. It's the perfect example of how efficiency on paper can turn into vulnerability on the ground. Let's talk about the scale of this. As of March 31, 2025, the federal civilian workforce, excluding the Postal Service, stood at 2,289,472 employees. By September 30, 2024, it had already dropped by more than 23,000. But if the OPM's projection holds, we're about to see the steepest single-year drop in modern history. Geographically, the impact isn't evenly spread. The Washington, D.C. metro area, covering D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, hosts the densest concentration, with over 141,000 federal employees in D.C. alone. But states like New Mexico, Hawaii, and Alaska also rely heavily on federal payrolls. In many rural counties, the government is one of the top 3 employers. Remove thousands of paychecks from those communities, and you don't just shrink government, you shrink the local economy. And speaking of paychecks, here's the math. In 2022, the federal civilian payroll was roughly $271 billion. Divide that by 2.2 million employees, and you get an average of about $123,000 per worker, including benefits. Cut 300,000 of those jobs, and you're looking at around $37 billion in lost annual income. That's a massive demand shock for housing markets, local businesses, and tax bases in regions that depend on federal spending. The economic ripples don't stop there. Remember the 2018 to 2019 government shutdown? The Congressional Budget Office estimated it shaved $11 billion off GDP, with $3 billion permanently lost, largely from delayed or canceled spending. That was with workers temporarily furloughed. This time, the positions are gone, permanently. There's also the hidden workforce to consider: federal contractors and grant-funded employees. The Atlanta Fed warns that if you include these, the total contraction could approach 1.2 million jobs nationwide. That's the shadow impact no headline number captures. And then there's institutional capacity. Lose too many experienced budget analysts, procurement officers, or regulatory experts, and you can't just replace them with a temp hire. That's why in the 1990s downsizing, agencies increasingly turned to outsourcing, often at higher long-term costs. We may be heading for that same trap: smaller headcount on paper, bigger bills in practice. Let's start with the apparent winners. In the private sector, there's a feeding frenzy for federal talent. Mid-career program managers, budget analysts, cybersecurity specialists, people who know how government really works, don't stay unemployed for long. Consulting firms that live off public sector contracts are already circling, ready to scoop up expertise the government just paid to train. If agencies shrink on paper but still have to deliver the same missions, outsourcing fills the gap. That means large systems integrators, beltway consultancies, and specialized tech vendors could see a rush of new agreements, often at higher per-hour rates than the salaries they replace. State and local governments also get a shot at hiring. City IT offices, public health departments, even school districts can suddenly attract resumes that would have been out of reach. For places like Phoenix, Denver, Austin, and Raleigh, cities with growing tech and life sciences clusters, this is a once-in-a-decade chance to upgrade their bench with people who can navigate grants, procurement, and compliance in their sleep. And then there are firms dependent on timely federal approvals. If reclassification makes some policy roles more responsive to political direction, certain industries could see a shorter path to green lights, faster permits here, looser guidance there. That's the theory anyway. But the losers? They're easier to name and harder to measure. Start with the communities where federal paychecks are the backbone of the local economy. The D.C., Maryland, Virginia corridor obviously gets hit, but so do small towns with big federal footprints, counties built around national labs, land management outposts, VA hospitals, or Social Security field offices. Pull out hundreds of stable middle-class incomes, and you don't just ding restaurants and daycare centers. You drain the mortgage market, the tax base, and the pipeline of volunteers who coach Little League and sit on nonprofit boards. Then there's institutional memory. You can't outsource a decade of permitting history or the judgment a veteran contracting officer brings when a billion-dollar bid looks off in ways only experience can detect. When those people walk, errors rise, projects slip, lawsuits multiply. The bill shows up later as cost overruns, emergency rehires, and temporary contracts that become permanent. Public-facing services feel it next. Even if most departures are voluntary, the workload doesn't vanish. Backlogs in disability claims, veterans' appeals, passports, and small business lending don't care whether a desk is empty because of a buyout or a pink slip. At airports, thinner staffing in key functions means more delays when something breaks. In fire season, losing logistics and planning specialists can be as dangerous as losing frontline crews. And when statistics shops bleed analysts, the quality of the data businesses and the Federal Reserve rely on starts to wobble, quietly at first, then all at once when a bad number leads to a bad decision. There's also a paradox for business. The same firms cheering deregulation still need predictable, competent regulators to issue clear rules, adjudicate disputes, and keep cheaters from undercutting them. If enforcement whipsaws or guidance disappears, compliant companies pay with uncertainty while bad actors gain an edge. Finally, the politics cuts both ways. A faster, more controllable policy apparatus can look like victory to any administration, until the next one flips those levers in the opposite direction. What starts as a tactical win can end as a structural vulnerability where expertise is precarious and every transition becomes a purge. Winners, in short, are concentrated and visible: consultancies, certain industries, a handful of growth cities. Losers are diffuse and cumulative: communities that hollow out, services that slow down, and a government that gets cheaper on the payroll line but more expensive everywhere else. So where does this go from here? Right now, 3 scenarios seem most likely. Scenario 1, full speed execution. The administration pushes through the 300,000 cuts, court challenges fizzle, and agencies scramble to backfill gaps with contractors. On paper, the headcount shrinks, the payroll drops, and political allies tout the savings. In practice, the government becomes more dependent on private vendors, and the quiet costs, delays, overruns, uneven service show up over the next few years. Scenario 2, judicial slowdown. Federal courts grant injunctions in key lawsuits, especially over the new schedule policy career classification, and agencies are forced to pause certain removals. The cuts still happen, but stretched over multiple years, buying time for Congress or future administrations to adjust course. Scenario 3, political reversal. A shift in Congress, say after midterms, produces budget riders that block further implementation or restore some protections. This wouldn't bring back everyone who's already gone, but it could halt the bleeding. The real question is long-term. What kind of federal government do we want? One that's leaner, more politically responsive, and more reliant on short-term contracts? Or one that keeps a large, protected civil service with deep institutional memory, but also the inertia and cost that come with it? We've been here before. The 1990s downsizing looked like a win until agencies realized they'd lost critical expertise and started paying more to hire it back through contractors who never left. We could be watching the opening act of that same play, only faster and more polarized. In the short run, you might notice fewer names on federal org charts. In the long run, you might notice slower disaster responses, more errors in government data, and a quiet but costly shift of taxpayer dollars from salaries to service contracts. This isn't just a DC story. If you live in a community with a VA hospital, a national park, a military base, or a research lab, the shockwaves will be local. This is about jobs, resilience, and the integrity of services we all use, even if we never think about the people providing them. So as this unfolds, pay attention to the details. Watch the OPM's quarterly FedScope data, follow the Merit Systems Protection Board rulings, and listen closely when local leaders talk about economic shifts. They might be feeling the loss long before the headlines catch up. If you found this breakdown useful, hit that like button. Share it with someone who still thinks downsizing is just a spreadsheet exercise, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into how national policy changes ripple into everyday life. Because whether you're a federal employee or just someone who needs their passport processed on time, this story is far from over.